De camino a casa, paro en una de mis charcas preferidas para observar a una pareja de cercetas coloradas. Varias golondrinas van y vienen por debajo del puente. Decenas de nidos pegados con barro contra el travesaño de hormigón. Una de ellas está muy atareada, tapizando con plumón blanco el interior de su nido con forma de tazón. Sale volando y regresa, segundos más tarde, con otra plumita en el pico. Me pregunto de dónde saca el alijo. Seguramente de un nido de gansos. Los nidos de la golondrina risqueta son muy distintos de los de la golondrina común, si bien ambas los construyen debajo de los puentes. Los nidos son cerrados, con un agujerito a modo de entrada. Una pareja cuyo nido aún no es más que un saliente se va turnando para traer pegotes de barro. 10 en 5 minutos. Al cabo de una hora, las he visto acarrear 120 pegotes de barro para su nueva residencia. Las golondrinas vuelan incansables hasta los barrizales del límite de la charca. Cargan el pico, vuelven a la casa en construcción y hacen vibrar las cabezas para colocar el barro en el nido, tras lo cual aplastan con vigor y le dan forma. Se alternan. El macho va del nido al barrizal y la hembra lo aplasta. Vuelve el macho, sale la hembra. Una y otra vez, la misma tarea meticulosa, mientras sus diminutos cuerpos recubiertos de plumas se estremecen con un objetivo. Poco a poco, a ritmo constante, el saliente se convierte en una morada cerrada. Los trompos de los flaropos, el cortejo de los somormuscos y achichiliques, la evolución del nido de la golondrina. Cada espectáculo es el despliegue de una historia natural. El zarapito americano, Numerius americanus, le debe su nombre al griego neos, nuevo, y amene, luna. Se creía que la forma de su largo pico se asemejaba a la curvatura de una luna finísima. Si la luna nueva se define como ausencia de luna o luna oscura, el zarapito podría asociarse con los poderes destructivos, dado que durante mucho tiempo se creyó que fantasmas, espíritus malignos y brujas alcanzaban su poder máximo con la oscuridad de la luna. La relación entre zarapitos y mágina negra no ha desaparecido del folclore. Una oración de las tierras altas escocesas pide protegerse de las brujas, hechiceros y criaturas de largo pico. En Escocia, el término wap sirve tanto para designar al zarapito como a un duende de pico largo que por las noches deambula bajo los aleros de los desvanes. Este ha sido un fragmento de la obra Refugio de Tempest Williams, que vendrá a continuación, pero primero vamos a recibir a la graduada de la Harvard Divinity School, que nos realizará una introducción sobre toro. Un aplauso, por favor, para Melissa Lago. Gracias.
Good evening. I am thrilled to be here today. I am deeply grateful to Terry Tempest Williams for the warmth and generosity of her mentorship and for the honor of including me in her program. I have had the honor and privilege of studying Henry David Thoreau's Walden with her this semester. And my gratitude to Amelia Lope for making this possible, and to the Harvard Buddhist Ministry Initiative for their generous support. A special thank you to the organizers of the Bilbao International Literature Festival for this amazing gathering and for paying tribute this year to Henry David Thoreau's Walden and to his teachings. He teaches us through his example what it means to be awake. On a personal note, it is wonderful to be back in Spain. I fell in love with this country when I walked the Camino de Santiago. I remember walking through fields of red poppies, listening to Gregorian chants, conversations with fellow pilgrims, and the people who welcomed me into the refugios, offering me encouragement, teaching me how to care for my blisters, and who gave me food and shelter. I am so grateful to be back in Spain over a decade later. In this talk, I seek to pay tribute to Thoreau and to his impact on my father's life and my own. I begin with my first trip to Walden Pond. In the summer of 2015, after several days of driving from my home in Berkeley, California, I arrived in Concord, Massachusetts. The next morning, I made my first pilgrimage to Walden Pond, where the sunlight, maple, beech and birch trees, birdsong, and warm water welcomed me. I was there to honor Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau, two men whose lives and wisdom had inspired my father, who died of cancer when I was 11 years old, and whose lives have since inspired me. On this first visit, I experienced a refuge from the fast-paced culture that often characterizes our modern life. Walden Pond gave me space to reflect on Thoreau's question, why should we hurry and waste life? Which feels as relevant today as when he first posed it. How do we stay present and take seriously Thoreau's observation that to be awake is to be alive? In the Buddhist tradition, it is often said that our true nature is that of a Buddha, a word simply meaning awake. And yet, it is very rare to meet a Buddha. As Thoreau wrote, quote, "I have never yet met one who is quite awake. How could I have looked him in the face?" Unquote. Many of us struggle to slow down and to live with this quality of wakefulness. Our entire society seems to push us to speed up. Yet pain, in the form of loss or an existential crisis, whether this is spurred by facing our own mortality or that of a loved one, or the loss of an entire species or forest, beckon us into the moment, offering us a glimpse of what it means to be awake. Pain becomes a catalyst that sets us on the path to awakening. A year before my first trip to Walden Pond, my father's friend Enrico shared an unexpected story with me. He said, "Melissa, your father almost committed suicide in his mid-30s. He was in his apartment in New York City, standing at the window, ready to jump, when suddenly the person on the floor above him jumped and fell to his death. I was astounded. My mother later confirmed this story was true. They both said the same thing. In that moment, he decided to live. He realized he didn't have to physically die to die to his life. Soon after, he went and boarded the ship for his next assignment to Vietnam with the U.S. Merchant Marine. During this trip, he met Eddie, who introduced him to the work of Emerson and Thoreau, which helped him to find new meaning. This work had a profound impact on him and spurred his lifelong journey and search for truth. Their transcendent ideas, combined with having to drop off another group of 18-year-olds to fight in the Vietnam War, a war he did not believe in, led to his decision to quit the Merchant Marine. I wonder if his choice was inspired by Thoreau's civil disobedience, because we know Thoreau would not support a war, the Mexican-American War, which he did not believe in. So when the ship docked in San Francisco, my father got off and never went back to his job or to his life in New York City. With this choice, he left the pain of his childhood and past behind him. A life fraught by poverty, violence, discrimination against Puerto Ricans. In California, my father, inspired by Thoreau, made his first connection with nature. Beyond the blades of grass that poked up through the broken concrete, he began going to Muir Woods to sit among the redwoods. It seems out of necessity, he had to learn a new mode of being, one that was attentive, quiet, patient, and present. Qualities that help us to be awake when sometimes denial and turning away feels easier. How do we live in the face of such grief? I still remember whispering, "Dad, I understand if it's time for you to move on. I will be okay." And it seemed he traveled a great distance back into his body, using what little strength he could gather to give me a kiss on my cheek. Then he turned his head, revealing his own cheek, and I kissed the pale flesh. Later that evening, he was rushed to the hospital and died. That night, I faced an emptiness that has never been matched, falling through space, darkness, nothing to hold on to. The next morning, I vowed to try to honor his life by living each day fully. This, of course, has meant very different things on different days. And since Thoreau had helped my father to do this, to live fully, it seemed fitting and was a great gift to be able to visit Walden Pond with Terry Tempest Williams on February 24th of this year, the 24th anniversary of my father's death. We walked quietly to the site of Thoreau's cabin in the woods. I heard the hum of cars, the train, and leaves and pine needles crinkling under our footsteps. Looking down, I was reminded of change. At Walden, Thoreau grieved the changes he witnessed around him: cut forests, the last bare, new settlements being built at the expense of wildness. Fast forward 164 years since the book Walden was published, and the fact is that today, Walden Pond is now facing even more severe environmental changes due to climate change and pollution. Pesticides and human waste are threatening its very survival. An entire species of fish that once inhabited this pond is gone. We each have these stories from our own communities: loss of people, loss of place, loss of species. How do we live in the face of such rapid change? I find, as Terry experienced after her mother died, that refuge lies not only in the land and in those closest to us, but in ourselves. And we can access this in any moment. We can ask ourselves, what do I see? What do I hear? What do I feel? We can activate qualities of being awake because, as Thoreau writes in his final reflection on Walden, quote, "Only that day dawns to which we are awake," unquote. Here is what I want to share with you. When we sat at the site of Thoreau's cabin, I smelled the wet earth. I heard the train pass by. I saw the light shining through the gray clouds. I wrote in my journal, thinking of my father on this anniversary of his death. His life, too, has returned to the earth like the oak leaves and like the body of Thoreau. To cultivate awareness is to cultivate awakening. Life is precious. And now we will receive Terry Tempest Williams in conversation with Francisco Ferrer. Muchas gracias. Hello, are you with me? Can you hear me? Hello? Hello, can you hear the English? Hello? Hello? Hi, Terry, can you hear the English? Hello? Hello, do you hear English? Can you not if you hear English?
Un poquito. Está bien, el número 1 está bien. Bien, buenas tardes.
Well, good afternoon or good evening. Let me introduce myself. My name is Francisco Ferrer Lerín. I am a writer, a philologist, and above all, I am an ornithology. So for many years, I've been working professionally, studying and protecting birds. In the Jaca, in the Pyrenees, were already in 1968. I was writing the list of the birds in the Pyrenees, and I was recovering also muladares, dunghills, places that for centuries help collect dead animals. When I was invited by the Alhóndiga Bilbao to participate in this event, I was told
Personalidades más importantes a nivel mundial.
They told me that I was going to meet one of the most important conservationists in the world. So I am talking about Terry Tempest from California. For many years, she's been working, protecting different areas in the planet, and precisely to study the great Salt Lake where she lives. The only book published in Spanish is Refugio. So this book is overwhelming, really, because it goes beyond this kind of sort of conservationist literature that usually are only just like mere speech about nature. Well, my question to you is the following. You're a very good writer, and I'd like to know whether you really got into literature thanks to your conservationist ethics, or before being concerned by the environment, you were already somehow writing, doing literature.
Yes, Francisco. And pardon if the translation, I'm getting used to it. Francisco, muchas gracias.
Sí.
Thank you for your beautiful work and poetry. I came to writing Refugio as a lover of birds and a lover of place. And I viewed the birds as family. And coming out of a Mormon background, I was raised with stories. So I think I was both naturalist and storyteller. And that's how I approached Refuge. And I will tell you that I approached Refuge with a question. And that question was, how do I find refuge in change? Because the landscape of my childhood, the Bear River Migratory Bird Refuge, was flooding because Great Salt Lake was rising. And the landscape of my family was in crisis because my mother was diagnosed with ovarian cancer. So that question, how does one find refuge in change, was what motivated me to write this book.
Muy bien. El libro, fundamentalmente,
when we analyze from a literature point of view this book, we see a perfect structure from a literature point of view that sort of evolves through a process. And that process is the evolution of a disease in a family environment. Different women in Terry's family in the latest years, they suffered breast cancer. Breast cancer doesn't evolve very fast nowadays. And in the morning, I mentioned that in the 17th and 16th centuries, in Italian painting, in 2 and 3 pictures or paintings, La Fornarina by Raphael, well, the people that studied the body of women, they've found out that the main character in the Fornarina has already breast cancer in one of her breasts. And in Spanish, there is a word that is zaratan, that comes from Arabic, zaratan, that meant crab, and then meant later on cancer, and finally breast cancer. It is the only cancer with a unique, with exclusive name. For the other cancers, we say colon cancer or bone cancer, but it seems this is the only disease that is evolving a lot and that has its own name. So this book, to me, sort of follows 2 parallel paths. On the one hand, we see cancer in your family with your mom, and then we see the fluctuations of the water level in the lake, in the Great Salt Lake. That could be due to natural reasons, but also lately due to some circumstances that she will let us know about. Maybe now this is sort of boosting because some actions are making these levels to sort of vary more often. And breast cancer, well, it's been acknowledged now that we see some peaks of the disease, and maybe now in that area also this disease is evolving more strongly. So, from your own point of view, what are the causes that led to the evolution of those cancers and also of the fluctuations of the seawater? Oh, sorry, of the water level.
May I tell you a story? After my mother died, a year went by, and my father invited me to dinner. And he said, "How are you?" And I said, not good. I keep having this nightmare, this flash of light in the night in the desert, illuminating buttes and mesas. Over and over and over again, this flash of light in the night, illuminating buttes and mesas. And he said, "You saw it." And I said, "Saw what?" And he said, "Well, I thought you knew that. We were coming home from California. You were sitting on your mother's lap. It was the day before your birthday, September 7th, 1957. Your mother was pregnant with Steve. We were driving toward Las Vegas an hour or so before dawn. All of a sudden, we saw this explosion. I thought the oil tanker in front of us had blown up. We pulled over to the side, and suddenly, rising from the desert floor, was this golden-stemmed cloud, the mushroom, the atomic bomb. At that moment, I realized I was one of the children growing up in the American Southwest, drinking contaminated milk, from contaminated cows, even the breasts of our mothers, members years later of the clan of one-breasted women. That was a shock to me. What I can tell you, Francisco, is 9 women in my family have all had breast cancer. 7 are dead. Half my family is dead from cancer. I believe this is because of the nuclear testing that took place in the desert. And when they tested those bombs from 1952 to 1962 above ground, they never tested them when the winds were blowing toward California, only when they were blowing toward Indian country and Mormons, because they felt that we were God-fearing people or ignorant people, that we would not question the government. And when I opened up the documents that had been secret, they called us a low-use segment of the population. We were expendable. So that's the background of this story. So I believe that it was nuclear testing in the desert, radiation fallout, like in Japan after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, Hibakusha people, explosion-affected people. And that is our history in the atomic West. That is our legacy as Americans. And people don't want to talk about that. And now President Trump is interested again in uranium mining and possible acceleration of nuclear weapons. Even, we hope, peace in North Korea. So we're watching. In terms of the rise of Great Salt Lake, in terms of your question, I saw these 2 parallel stories. The effect of the environment on my family, the effect of flooding on the Bear River Bird Refuge, Great Salt Lake. This morning you asked me an astute question, but wasn't that natural with Great Salt Lake? Yes, except for there was no place for the lake to expand because of a highway, because of a freeway, because of the airport, because of sewage plants and mineral chemical plants. So nothing is natural anymore.
Bien, entonces tenemos...
So we have a natural event, the fluctuations of the lake. These fluctuations might vary according to human interventions. And then we have a disease that's been there maybe since the origin of our species, but due to certain circumstances like acid rain coming from the nuclear explosions or tests in the desert maybe increased the cases of cancer. That is a fact. Okay, so starting from these 2 elements, I think, is how you build this book. And I think also birds are very important in this book. So you have very short chapters, which is a very wise thing to do from a literature point of view, because this allows in short chapters or titled after the name of a bird, then the narrative tension is always very high. I don't know, this is just a fruit of a natural intuition, or maybe you have a literature agent that told you, Terry, this is how you have to write the book, because then the result is going to be excellent.
If the agent was here, he would say, it wouldn't be very successful to tell me to do something. I have to feel it. I have to intuit it. And I love my agent, Carl Brandt, very much. But this was a book I had to write. And I organized it in chapters with birds at the helm, because each bird became both a fact and a metaphor. So, for example, on long-billed curlew, that is a book that portends death in Scottish and British history. So that was really the chapter that portended that that gave the hint that death was coming. And it was there that I also proclaimed my devotion to the birds themselves, even as a blasphemous statement. And I'm wondering if you, could I read this? It's, I pray to the birds. I pray to the birds because I believe they will carry the messages of my heart upward. I pray to them because I believe in their existence, the way their songs begin and end each day, the invocations and benedictions of earth. I pray to the birds because they remind me of what I love rather than what I fear, and at the end of my prayers, they teach me how to listen. I think the birds taught me how to listen, even to the cycles of life and the impending death of my mother. They prepared me for my own grief. And I think they prepared my mother for peace, even in her death.
La secuencia.
The sequence of the death and before the death, the final stage of the disease of your mom, from a technical point of view, is perfect. From a literature point of view, you dose the tale and you keep the reader really anxious to read more. And then you fragment these along the chapters as well. So this story of the death of your mom, which is a real story, is framed within a world that to me is shocking, that maybe it is not easy to understand in Europe. That is your life as member of a religious community, Mormons. And often from our point of view, and given what we know in different forms of Christianisms, the Christian religion is never very sensitive to nature. So my question is, in the States, are Mormons environmentally sensitive, which we are not here, Catholics in Europe? If that is the case, if you sort of show special care or you pay special attention in your religion to nature, how much does this have an impact in your life and in the way you approach the disease and how you relate to nature?
Yeah.
Yes. I think historically, Mormons were very attentive to the land. When they arrived in this great salt desert with a salt sea, an inland sea, it was a relief to them. It was a refuge for them from religious persecution that they had faced coming across the American West from Missouri. And they knew they were in land of little water, so they conserved water, and they planted seeds that were water tolerant. And so there was a great ethic of land and people early on. But as we see in America and all over the world, as we expand in population, as pressures build, more water gets used, reservoirs get built, and greed enters in. And I think it can be said, although I could be criticized for this, the Mormon Church is an American religion. It's an early, young religion. And I think it mirrors the capitalism of America per se. And now, since you asked the question, I believe that the Mormon Church is pro-development. They are not sensitive to the environment. And we can see that most powerfully in the conflict now in Utah with a place called Bears Ears National Monument. President Obama set this aside in honor of Native people, Navajo, Hopi, Zuni, and the Ute Nations, saying these are sacred lands that should be protected, a delicate desert. And conservationists became allies with the Native people. And it was a historic moment of building trust between the United States government and Indian people. A year later, Donald Trump becomes president, and he undoes that monument, guts Bear's Ears, and Orrin Hatch, who is Mormon, and a senator in the United States Congress, says, we don't need this. And now that land is being taken from the native people, no longer protected, and opened up to oil and gas, uranium, and coal. And I think we see inherent in the Mormon religion racism against Indian people and greed on behalf of the oil and gas development. So it's complicated, but I think we have strayed from our original sustainable roots with the desert as a desert people, and we have now become part of the American consumption culture, sadly.
Entonces, se podría decir.
So one could say that your family, yourself, and your family, you are in a section within the Mormons, not only in what regards that you are conservationist and the Mormons in general are not, but also in the case of breast cancer, you acknowledge in your book, Refuge, that Mormons don't tend to have breast cancer because they don't have a coffee intake or tea intake. They have, before they're 30, their children. So these are some different sort of, hints that describe or define Mormon women. So you're a bit like on the edge of the Mormon community, you and your family? Are you a bit different somehow?
Talk to. But I would say a few things. One, there are many Mormons, and especially young people, who are becoming active in conservation and who are moving the church in a new direction to say, the earth is creation, and we need to take care of it. So I see an evolution in the Mormon church that is very positive. I also see an evolution with the women in the Mormon church. And the Mormon church may not be changing, but the women in the church are changing, and therefore it's becoming more open to women's voices. So I may be an extreme person on the left of Mormon religion. They have not excommunicated me yet. Knock on wood. Where is some wood? Some trees. But I also am not active anymore. I am not an Orthodox Mormon, but I am culturally a Mormon, and I appreciate the deep sense of place that Mormon people have. I have that too. Utah is home. The American West is home. And I love the sense of community that is very deep in the Mormon church. What you were saying about how prior to the nuclear testing, cancer was not so common in Mormon people. I have been very moved being here in Bilbao, talking with women friends who, you know, everyone has been affected by cancer. And I think now this is a global phenomenon, and I do believe it's tied to foods, to toxic situations, water, soil. It's all related, interconnected. So it's not just a Utah story or a Mormon story, but I think now it's a global story, how our health and the health of the planet is one. Our body, the body of the earth, no separation.
Indudablemente estoy.
I fully agree. Well, to talk more about environment, we've got the actions of human beings in nature, but not to destroy, with a will to destroy nature, but Yes, like as we say in Spanish, pasando, we pass off the environment, they don't take care of it. And now there is this initiative to try to protect nature. And in your book, you suggest solutions to prevent the fluctuations in the Great Salt Lake. And all over the world, the ornithologists, we see a paradox, and we see the particular case of the condor in California. It is the biggest bird, flying bird. It used to be all over North America, from Alaska all the way to Mexico, and even it was in some of the Caribbean countries. But due to the use of poisons by farmers, they were about to disappear. I don't know how many were left, some 15 or 24 were left. Then the US administration, pressed maybe by the conservationists, they took a very dramatic measure. They collected of Californian condors that were alive, kept them in captivity for a while, for many years. They reproduced them in captivity. They prevented these birds from being impregnated by human presence, and little by little, they've been releasing them back in nature. This morning, we were saying that in Grand Canyon, we see condors flying around. So this is a good case of human intervention. And in Europe, we have a similar case. And this is the case of the birded vulture that was about to disappear. In fact, the population in Europe was only in the Pyrenees, and also in south of Spain, there was another group of these vultures in the Cazorla Hills. But they disappeared there. They didn't do anything, and they disappeared from the south of Spain. And this species, little by little, with some methods, we've recovered these birds, the birded vultures, and now we have a certain number of them, and they're released now in the Pyrenees, and they are flying over, particularly the region of Navarra. So, do conservationists appreciate in the States these kind of actions, or do they think that intervening even to force a recovery is something that shouldn't be done, or that does not agree with reality?
I appreciate your work as an ornithologist with birds, and I also appreciate your work as a poet, of where you talk about the natural world and death and carrion and these cycles. I've been very moved by how you have brought these together in discussion and in language. Again, I think I want to say that conservation efforts are appreciated in America, and I think the majority of American citizens feel this way. And the condor example that you give is a powerful one. And in fact, they were in a community called Ojai that Melissa Lago comes from. And she saw those as a child. We were talking about that this morning. And then, as you say, they did a radical reintroduction, restoration project and reintroduced them in Grand Canyon and along Point Reyes or Big Sur, and you see these magnificent birds, and with numbers on them, because they're still being monitored. I think people think this is a great thing, and it was precipitated by the Endangered Species Act, and I think this shows how laws can protect species. I hate to keep bringing up the shadow side, but the reality is that with this current administration, the Trump administration, they are not only gutting and destroying our national monuments and threatening our national parks that all people around the world enjoy, they're trying to destroy and diminish, tear apart the Endangered Species Act. So we're concerned. Those of us in the conservation movement in America are deeply concerned. But I still believe that the majority of American citizens do care about conservation.
No funciona. Vamos a ver. Voy a hacerte una serie de preguntas.
May I tell you one story? And I think this might be interesting to the audience.
Sí, cómo no.
a friend of mine, Steve Martin, was the superintendent of Grand Canyon National Park. And I said to him, how are the condors doing? And he said, the condors are doing fine, but they're also helping us. And I said, how is that so? And he said, many, and this is, I apologize because this is a bit macabre, but a lot of people come to the Grand Canyon and commit suicide. That's a fact, which is terrible. But he said it used to be, it would take months, days, weeks, months, even years to recover their bodies. Now, if someone dies in the Grand Canyon, all they have to do is see where the condors are circling, which is a matter of days. And he said, so the condors are now working for us in helping to locate bodies. And what I loved about you, Francisco, do you remember what you said to me?
Sí, bueno, te he dicho muchas cosas.
I told you many things.
Francisco, you said, did they let them eat the bodies?
Quisiera saber...
This is a man who loves carrion birds, birds who eat carrion, forgive me.
Pero ya localizan el cadáver, sería mejor.
Well, they locate the corpse, so we better just like leave them where they are. We don't allow condors to be fed on these dead bodies, just like at least eat a hand or something, just a little tiny bit.
Yes, and my husband would agree with you. My husband would agree with you. He wants to be just taken to the Grand Canyon and become a bird so he can fly again. That's eternal life. Lo siento.
Yo ahora, si me permites, te voy a contar una historia.
If you allow me, I am going to tell you also a very macabre story, maybe not as much as yours. In 1963-64, I was doing my military service. As I met somebody that introduced me to ornithologists, to this world. I always loved nature in general, but especially amphibians and reptiles, but they're easier to handle. And when I was bound to study medicine because my father was a doctor and I loved animals, but I didn't care at all about birds. Maybe because I grew up in a city and the only birds that I would see were like city pigeons that we should exterminate if possible. So this man starts talking about birds, and then when this country was still underdeveloped and we were fighting to develop the country, some people began to own cars, 600 car. It was a tiny car that people would buy. People would travel in these tiny cars. And at the time, we thought we were already almost a developed country, almost European countries. And then I found out that there are some structures that are 2.7 meters big that fly over our heads looking for carrion. And I was shocked. Well, these griffon vultures in 1962-63, they were quite abundant, and they would fly looking for dead bodies of animals, maybe some also hiker that sort of got lost. But during this development in the 60s, then in the farms, they no longer use, the tractors. And they give up on what used to be called the blood traction, that is animal traction with blood. So then these big scavengers would disappear. And then I decide to defend these birds, the carrion birds or scavengers. So what we do with other friends, we would go and take, and I say take not to say steal, from the zoo in Barcelona, the food that would be given to the wild animals in the zoo in Barcelona. So all the dead heads of animals, we would go there at night, through the backyard, and we would go and take, and I say take, those heads in our cars. Well, not our cars, our parents' cars. And then our parents would go like, why does this car really stink? It smells awful. Then we would take these dead things to the Pyrenees in Huesca, and then we would be trying to recover the population of vultures. And then in 1968, I began working in a research center in Jaca at the time, that depending on the scientific ministry for research in Spain. And then I tried to recover the muladar, these places like dunghill sort of, where they would put all the dead animals so vultures could come and eat. So the Californian condor and the griffon vultures ran a similar luck, and they've been so lucky that nowadays there is an overdose or an excess of vultures, of this kind of griffon vulture. And here I'm not being political at all. I am not being also metaphoric. I mean, there are too many vultures in Spain, and we now export griffon vultures.
Conservation and environmentalists have to be passionate, right?
En los Balcanes, en Sicilia.
In Balkans, in Sicily, in the Alps, the vultures were extinct. They disappeared. We are now exporting vultures, and we now see them flying all over. Well, I like...
Gracias, pero un momento, no te vayas.
No, don't leave us. He thought it was thank you because you were saying goodbye. In a moment in your life, you move away from cities because you were not born in a little village, were you? And then you talked about Walden and Thoreau, and then you settle in the desert, in the nature, in a moment in your lives. So this is a movement that happens in some lives, and this is happening in some areas in the world. People are leaving cities, and they try to live in a sustainable way in nature. Don't you think if this example becomes too large, so many people would move from cities to the countryside, then the countryside will be full up with people that maybe they have a very good will, but they're going to ruin the environment? It is a question. I wonder.
See that the trend all over the world is people are moving from the rural communities into the cities. And I think that it's this migration to the cities that is creating a disconnect with the earth itself. So I think that's the real issue. But your point's well taken. You know, for those like myself who are moving to a quieter place, are we threatening to destroy the very landscape we love? And it could be argued that we are. Where Brooke and I live, it's a desert landscape, it's a fragile landscape, but it is a community. And so we are in a cluster, and then we have a lot of open space around us, similar to some of the villages in Spain. And so in that sense, it is more ecological. But, you know, we are in the desert, we are in times of drought, and I think it's questionable if we can stay there given climate change. And so we have to be very careful about water conservation. Many people, we have a cooperative where one of the schools has a farm, and we get our food from there. So it's, again, these are choices. I don't think a lot of people will move to where we are because a lot of people are lonely out there.
Esperemos.
You know, I have to tell you, a woman from New York came to visit us. She was a very high-powered producer for CBS News. She arrived at night. She saw all this space, and it was way too quiet. And in the morning, she had her bags packed, and she wanted to go back. And she said to me, "Aren't you afraid you'll be forgotten out here?" Who cares? You know, it's just two different points of view.
Eso espero, o sea que no prospera.
Well, I hope so. Not too many people follow your idea, your example. This morning we also said that in this book, up until page 397, Terry does not mention the overpopulation of planet Earth as a main risk for sustainability and for things to work properly from an environmental point of view. And I also told you that when I went in high school, there were 19 million inhabitants in Spain. Now we're 47 millions. 47 millions concentrated in specific areas, like basically the seashore or in specific cities inland, where there is an issue, this lack of water. Since in the book this is only mentioned sort of not very deeply, do you think one of the main issues of the human beings is the overdose of human beings, precisely the excess of human beings?
It's up. And I think in the United States, environmental organizations do not talk about population. They're worried that it will offend donors. They're worried that it will offend membership and that they will stop supporting them. So it's a big issue. I'm glad at least I mentioned it, you know. My husband and I chose not to have children. And we have an adopted son from Rwanda. So, you know, I think each person has to look into their own life and their own hearts and make those decisions. Utah's birth rate is very high because of the Mormon religion. But because of economics, it's going down, because families with 10 children and more can't support them. So I think the average is going down. But I personally agree with you. I think that population is an issue. It's politically difficult to talk about because then issues of race come in, saying, you know, I wrote an essay once that said there are too many of us, and I was criticized saying that that was a racial comment, that that was my white privilege that was saying that. You know, we have a son from Rwanda. They lost over 1 million people in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. That population has now increased, you know, and many of the women wanted children again. You know, is that ours to criticize? So these are politically difficult questions to raise, but I think it is our problem because of the resources. And I think, you know, when we look at the issues of oil and fossil fuels and the relationship it has to climate change, you know, that's an issue. I think 20 years from now, water is going to be the issue. So we are in an ecological crisis. I would argue that it is also a spiritual crisis, and that we have to come to grips with the supremacy of our own species.
Ya que has hablado de Ruanda, deduzco que conoce.
Since you mentioned Rwanda, I guess you know the Black Africa. If we could measure suffering in, we could have some cells to measure the suffering of children and women in Africa, we will see how those suffering rates sort of rocket. In Nigeria, there are areas where the population has multiplied by 20 or by 15 in the last years. Children there still have 15 children like in the past. What I'm going to say is very hard. But before those, out of those 15 children, maybe only one could survive. And now all of them survive thanks to the arrival of medicines, of missionary men and doctors that help them. But they live for 5-6 years in very bad situations, and they end up dying. This is my own personal opinion. As long as we do not decrease the pressure of religion, as long as women cannot make decisions, and I am talking about Black Africa, but this could be a global issue in the field of reproduction, I think this issue will prevail. And this is a very serious issue, not only because nature cannot cope with more people, but also because of the suffering that this bad policy creates, that only leads to the encouragement of birth natality or birth rate, to the increase of birth rate. This is my own personal view. I don't know if you agree or disagree with me, but I think we should really limit drastically the amount of babies being born.
I'm uncomfortable talking about this, particularly about Africa. I feel I don't know enough, and again, my own privilege comes into this. But what I do know is that as women become, Wangari Maathai was a great mentor of mine who won the Nobel Prize as an environmentalist for the Green Belt movement from Kenya. And we had many conversations about this. And what she taught me was that as women's education rises, the birth rate goes down. And what they realized is that, women were spending 8 to 10 hours a day in search of water and fuel. And when they started planting trees, then their quality of life, improved. And now with technology and more efficient stoves, their quality of life improves. So I think as quality of life improves, women's lives, benefit. And then I think when women's lives benefit, they have more control of their lives and their reproduction. So I think it's all interconnected, but I think it's a global issue. And it goes back to education and women's right to have control over their own bodies.
Estoy completamente de acuerdo. Bien, yo no sé de qué tiempo.
I fully agree.
Mother and grandmother and I had. And I think, growing up in a patriarchal religion, which Mormon is, women don't have the priesthood. We had those conversations that as women, we must have control over our own lives. My mother had control over her own illness, insofar as there was a point where she said, I don't want any more chemotherapy. I want a quality of life, not a quantity of life. That's, I think, another example. But I think what we're talking about, Francisco, is, how do we embrace the earth as our own body? And how do we embrace death as part of life? And these are the hard conversations. You and I have just had a hard conversation, but I think that's what we do as writers. We're bearing witness to suffering, bearing witness to the dying, bearing witness to a loss of species, bearing witness to beauty. And beauty is not optional, but a strategy for survival. And I think it's in bearing witness as writers, and we've heard beautiful writers in this entire conference, we recognize that bearing witness is not a passive act, but an act of consciousness and consequence. So I think we're talking about how to be engaged, how to be awake, alert, and alive, as Thoreau has taught us, as Melissa was talking about. And I'm so grateful to the organizers of this conference and the journalists and the other writers who are asking these tough questions, creating public spaces where these kinds of conversations can occur.
En cualquier caso, queda claro.
What is clear is that, as you said, this is a delicate issue, and even politically in Europe, it is never really fully tackled, birth rate, or birth control. To put it simple, not even the right-wing or the left-wing parties want to talk about this issue and try to sort it out. Like in everything else, I think culture and education are the only way out for this kind of issues, because I think if we keep on growing in the amount of population and we end up having 20 billion people in the world, it's going to be very difficult to keep on observing birds, to enjoy nature, because the human beings are going to eat everything, devour everything.
But you can understand that, you know, I just was in China for a month, which is not long, but it was a dose where, you know, the people in the rural communities want the same thing we have in España, in the United States. You know, I talk to Louis, our son, who's Rwandan, all the time. He wants the same development that we have. So it's difficult, you know, and that's where I think it does go back to a spiritual set of values of, do we want to live with other species, or do we just care about ourselves? And, you know, I remember growing up, there was an artist named Tiny Hagen, and there was a picture that he took from another American writer, Ernest Thompson Seton, and he had, a man was sitting on the earth like this, and there was a squirrel resting on his feet, and he had a machete, and he was coming down to kill the squirrel, but you knew what was going to happen. He was going to hurt himself. And that's why I think we have to realize when we destroy nature, we're destroying ourselves. And again, there's no separation. And I think we have made that disconnect at our own peril. And in many ways, I think that's what Refugio is about, that the cycle of nature of birds, the cycle of nature of human beings, it's all the same thing. And can we dare to stay present? Can we dare not to look away and really look at our grief, look at our broken hearts, and still fall in love with the world and protect it?
Es admirable tu visión.
I really admire your spiritual vision of these subjects that sometimes we approach from a different point of view. I am an optimistic, and in a field where maybe you are not an optimistic yourself. I think science and technology might sort out some of the problems we cannot solve now, like the issue of plastics. There is this island floating in the Pacific Ocean made of a plastic that is as big as the Iberian Peninsula. And this is a very serious issue, not only because we see a turtle about to suffocate, but mainly because this means this is the paradigm of what we are doing to planet Earth. But I know there is research being done, and deep research to sort this issue that really plastic become a decaying matter. And also alternative energies. These should really work, because in this country they wanted to use different renewables energies, and then they gave up, so that's good for nothing. And then also from a merely ecologic or environmentalist approach, when we see the windmills, everybody say, wow, this is a clean energy. I think this is a way to produce energy that is outrageous for the fauna. Large birds are dying because they feel attracted to by the windmills, and then they sort of bang themselves against, and they died. And then maybe we are wrong. We've got to wonder, maybe nuclear plants, once we get done with the waste of the nuclear plants from a landscape point of view and from a technical point of view, that might be the solution. So I was one of the founders and creators of the first environmentalist movements here in Spain, but our statements at the time do not agree with the ones we defend now. We are against bullfighting. For example, bullfighting was disgusting to us because they were torturing animals. But now there is a new movement, the animalist movement, that is replacing the environmentalist. Why? because at the end of the day, the great capital is sort of behind those animals and that trend to have a pet, because behind the animals you have how to feed the animal, the doctors for the animals, medicines for the animals, so the capital is behind it. So I think in some of these issues that we thought were fundamental, maybe we have to review them and see them in a different way. This is what I think. I am an optimistic. I know you are also an optimistic with a different approach, but I think somehow we sort of agree deep down.
I do think we agree. You know, our approach is different. And I actually think art has a deeply important role in this. And I think we saw last night with Madère Lopez and how she talked about with her installation of growing grasses. You know, it's a different point of view. Or I loved the beach with red towels. You know, art has a way of bypassing rhetoric and piercing the heart and starting a different conversation. I think we have minimized the power of the emotional register. And so we live up here when, in fact, we change by a change of point of view, a change of heart. And I think the artists allow us that. Poetry, novels. One of the reasons when I was living in Spain, I was so moved by the power of art. There was an artist, I remember it was in Barcelona at the Fundación de Miró, the Miró Foundation, and her name was Jackie Bruckner, and she took soils from all over Spain, from Catalonia, from Andalusia, from Galicia, you know, the Basque Country, and each soil was a different color. And then she rolled it up into a tongue. And it was so powerful how, you know, we are born out of the soil of our cultures. And if we remove that soil, we remove our capacity to speak in a deep way of place. And that was the artist's gift. So again, I think we can't discount the arts in conversation with the sciences and technology and economics, but realize we all benefit from a different lens of seeing the world.
Estoy completamente de acuerdo.
I fully agree. Is there something else you would like to add or to ask me?
There is no greater passion for those of us who love the desert than to contemplate the nuptials of the dwarf bee. You know, I mean, you and I share that love of the desert and of looking at the small and feeling the large. I loved when you said in the inventory, men, there are none. Lizards, 500,000. Serpents, 500,000. Spiders, 1 million. Salamanders, unknown. Devils, yes, there are. But to pay attention to the other species that we live with so that community can become not just human beings, but plants, animals, rocks, rivers, and human beings. That you honor carrion feeders. And I love when I learned that Francisco is a superb gambler. Is that right? You play poker. Yes?
No, bueno, durante mi juventud.
In my youth, I used to play poker, and then with the money I would make, I would fund all my excursions to the landscape to pay the food for vultures. I bought a Russian car, a Lada Nirva, and there we would transport all this waste, not human waste, but animal waste, and we will then pour them in the landscape. So this is why I was gambling or playing poker.
But what I love today when you asked me if I played poker, and what I said is I play poker on the page every day as a writer. I risk my soul. But what I loved when you said I would bet everything on nature. And I think that's really where we are, is that if we are to survive, We have to bet everything. We have to give all we have to the survival of other species so that we too can survive as a larger Earth community. And I so appreciate your work and commitment for birds of prey, for the environment, and for asking the difficult questions. And I so appreciate the Azcuna Zentra. My Spanish is so terrible, lo siento, mi español es mal. And I really want to say that there was a time in my life where I went to Dananya, Coro Dananya, and I stood side by side with some of those activists. And I thought, that marsh is being protected by love in the same way that Bear River, the marsh I love in Great Salt Lake, is protected by love. And that we dare to look at beauty, and we also dare to look at death, and we dare not to look away. So I'm so grateful for that. And I just want to say that I'm grateful to Maria Luisa Blanca and Alasna, Alasna Martin, and Marianne Maruri, who is the translator, and Juana Lor, and Teresia Constenla, and Adrian Mateas, if I said it wrong. I just want to say that I'm so grateful to you for being here, La Gente of Bilbao, and how humbling it is to be an American writer at this conference, and I don't take it for granted. And Francisco, muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Bien, yo pediría a esta gente de Bilbao.
I will request from these people in Bilbao that appreciate you so much to their making questions to Terry or to you, well, about anything. Well, not really anything, but about things related to environment and maybe to literature.
I wouldn't even be here if it wasn't for Amelia Lope and Susana Rodriguez Alvarez and the wonderful publishing house of Errata Natura. Is that how you pronounce it?
Errata Naturi.
I'm so grateful, and to the translator.
Naturi.
So mucho gratitud.
Gabón. El otro día, Manuel
Rivas said that I was lucky. This morning I heard a cricket. Every day I walk by the seashore, and I've been very lucky because I heard a cricket. There used to be thousands of crickets, and now I've heard a cricket. And where there used to be millions of birds, according to Rodríguez de la Fuente, a very well-known environmentalist in Spain, I don't hear many pigeons. I don't hear all the birds that we used to have here locally. And according to the encyclopedia, some 50,000 would fly through our skies. And now I say, where are they? Often I feel sad because I no longer see them. I wonder who have killed these birds. I mean, even the sparrows are disappearing. I know somehow mafias, international mafias with chemical products are killing people and birds, especially Monsanto. North American Monsanto, I think in this kind of fora, we've got to go against them, raise our voice against them. It is even said that now with the glyphosate, they are creating cancer in farmers. So if we don't put an end to these kind of corporations like Bayer as well, they are going to end with all birds, no matter how many efforts you undertake yourselves. Yes, there is the issue of pesticides, all the chemical products used in the countryside. It's been a determinant for the dispersion of many of the species. That was the case in the States and in Europe. But some products like DDT that finally were banned in the Western countries still are sold and produced and used in the third world countries. The use of DDT in Africa is finishing with the fauna, the small creatures in Africa. You can not only have into account elephants or giraffes, also little creatures, insects. Once the insects are gone, the trophic chain is in danger, because also those that are fed on those insects dies, and then those that eat those other ones also disappear. So the only hope is that the great capital, great corporations like Monsanto or Bayer, not that they become aware of what's happening, that is that they will suffer from what is happening, but that's not going to be the case, but they should realize that also modifying some parameters is a business. So maybe if they produce differently some products, there is money behind that, they could make money. So that is where we see some ground for hope. We saw some news recently about pesticides that are infecting bees. And bees are essential to life, to pollinate flowers. And there are some 2-3 products that are killing them. And it seems some big corporations have reacted and are no longer using them. And this is ground for hope. And this is another piece of news, the use of diclofenac in India. India used to be the country of birds. If you've ever been to India, you maybe were shocked by the amount of vultures that were there. But diclofenac, that is used in many things like eye drops. It's an anti-inflammatory substance, has been largely used in India. So all the dead bodies of cows were full of this substance, and then vultures would almost disappear. In a few years, there's been a 90% reduction of the population of vultures. And this is why, this is because farmers in Spain and in other countries are using this diclofenac. And this is not only having an impact on vultures, this is also having an impact on people. So this is very true what you've said. We have to pay attention because this diclofenac is having an impact also on human beings. Something else?
In the United States, this is an issue that Rachel Carson brought up in 1962 with her landmark book, Silent Spring. And we did ban DDT, and things have gotten better, but then we've gone backward. We have Scott Pruitt, who's running the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and is removing these restrictions and laws so that polluters can continue devastating practices. And so I feel like with the Trump administration, we are going back in time rather than forward. And they're supporting corporations like Monsanto and Dow Chemical and again, the fossil fuel industry, so that there aren't the regulations in place for not only human health, but planetary health with birds and so on and so forth. So again, this importance of resistance in the United States, that's what it means to be an environmentalist and a conservationist now. And I will say this, we are taking up Thoreau's banner of civil disobedience, whether it's climate justice or public lands or public health. There are a lot of eruptions in the United States in the name of social justice and ecological justice. Other questions?
Hay una cosa que quisiera apuntar.
There's one thing I'd like to mention. Maybe we should be more dirty because we are too clean. Our bathrooms are the source of the largest concentration of pollutants. If we think of what we use, soap, shampoo, toothpaste, deodorants, and another 50 chemical products that end up in our sewage system, and then it is treated and it costs a lot. So maybe we should request people not to have a shower every day, or maybe to just shower with water and end up using so much soap. What happened with detergents? The generation of my parents was the generation of the medicines or drugs. And he would sit to dinner, and in front of him, he would have a line of drugs that he would take. Nowadays, this has been replaced by soaps or detergents. There is like a whole room in my home with different kind of products to clean the bathroom, to clean the clothes. This is a source of pollution, and people are not aware of it. And this wet towel with wet tissues that are used to wipe babies' bottoms and so on are blocking the sewage system because people just like flush them through the toilet. So this requires of an environmental education that should be maybe done on TV or by other means, because we are really destroying the planet. We have this giant island of plastic in the Pacific Ocean, and this is what we are all bound to, and we're doing nothing. One of the newest things are microparticles that are used in toothpaste and in other products to sort of whiten your teeth, but then they end up in the ocean. And this is killing not only fishes, but also smaller creatures. So these are the things that the chemical industry is sort of using as innovation, and nobody's putting an end to it.
Bring it back home, literally, that it's individual choices that loom large. And when you talk about plastics, I would urge the audience, there's a beautiful film that has been made by Chris Jordan, and I think it's an example, again, how art can move us to a different way of being. It's called Albatross, and if you Google it, it's open source, and you can have a group of friends or family and watch this film that talks about how the plastics are affecting the albatross and how one person's journey led him to a different way of living. It's a very moving piece. And I think I would like to close with just the hope that we might think of a different kind of power, not a power over, but a power with, and that we might be able to ask the question, what might a different kind of power look like? And do we have the generosity to extend this notion of power to all species, not just our own? The eyes of the future are looking back at us, and they are praying that we might see beyond our own time. And that is my prayer too. Thank you so much to the organizers, to this beautiful public space, to you, Francisco, and to all of you who care so much about literature in Spain and extend this invitation to writers from all over the world to come to this beautiful conference in Bilbao. Deep, deep privilege, and I stand with you. Thank you.